Tokyo 42 is the first game from two-man indie development team SMAC Games. Made up of coder Sean Wright and artist Maciek Strzałowski, Tokyo 42 is an action game played from a series of fixed perspectives that the player is able to rotate between at will. Played from a drone's eye perspective, Tokyo 42 has the player function as an assassin, navigating through a dense urban cityscape to bypass or kill guards in order to take out their target. Although the game also has a few other game modes such as motorcycle racing, death matches and parkour challenges, as well as a special emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving. Tokyo 42 takes place in the Tokyo of the future. Rather than the rainy and decaying streets of Akira or Ghost in the Shell, Tokyo 42's future is a psychedelic trip of dizzying neon advertisements, sweeping clean lines and a vibrant high-contrast colour palette. Sky traffic is everywhere, and nanomeds, a widely available medicine, mean that death itself is a thing of the past for inhabitants of the city. Dying isn't something to be feared anymore, which means that the trade for assassins has somehow experienced a corresponding boom. It's entirely possible to send someone a message by blowing them up or shooting them in the head, safe in the knowledge that they'll just wake up later with a few unpleasant memories. The game starts off with your unnamed protagonist sitting alone in the apartment watching the news. There's been a murder, someone has been permanently killed, and you're revealed to be the prime suspect. You flee your apartment and outrun the police before being rescued by someone involved in the city's criminal underworld. It turns out you've been framed for the murder, and in order to uncover the truth as to why, you have to become an assassin yourself. What follows is a series of missions across the city that see you assassinate targets for a variety of different employers. Aside from the main story missions, there's also a number of side missions that you can take from various characters you meet as well as from mission terminals dotted throughout the city. Missions in Tokyo 42 can mostly be approached either via stealth or going loud. Environments typically have a lot of cover you can crouch behind it, and enemies have a relatively forgiving ability to detect you when you're sneaking up on them. Melee weapons are silent and everything's a one-hit kill, and I guess death is something people just ignore completely, as guards will happily walk over their friends after they've been beaten to death and think nothing of it. You can equip disguises to blend in with the various gangs and groups in the city, but these drain your energy reserves so quickly they can only really be used in short bursts. You also have the ability to completely change your appearance when being pursued, which enables you to easily avoid detection if you manage to get your enemies to lose sight of you. Going loud can actually get pretty dangerous. You die in one hit, as does everyone else in Tokyo 42, and all it really takes is one stray bullet from an angle you weren't expecting, and you're dead. This fragility is compounded by the fact it can be quite difficult to avoid bullets, necessitating you keep your head down, but when doing this, enemies can get incredibly grenade happy and are pretty good at flushing you out of cover so they can get a clear shot. One thing I want to mention right off the bat is that this game looks beautiful. Strzałowski really outdid himself with the design and the realisation of the city, and I love how the city can both look colourful and inviting while also maintaining sinister undertones. Eyes are everywhere, which give you the impression you're being watched. The advertisements from the corporation that manufacture nanomeds are everywhere as well, and the pills themselves enjoy religious reverence, having both huge statues dedicated to them as well as an entire imposing cathedral that dominates the city skyline. The whole city seems to be built around nanomeds, and they're so ubiquitous that death isn't really a consideration that most people take seriously, with some pedestrians even remarking that dying is simply old school. The game also wears some of its inspirations on its sleeve. Some that stood out to me were the bosses that look like the robotic tanks or the Tachikoma from Ghost in the Shell. The coat that's named after the main protagonist of Blade Runner, or one of the missions that's named after the excellent film Redline. The soundtrack by Beat Vince is also excellent. It's this otherworldly and bizarre synth soundtrack that both makes the city seem fun and inviting as well as almost alien or dreamlike in how it feels. You're in this bizarre wonderland up in the clouds where the regular rules of reality don't seem to apply. Although it's not quite as overt as Bioshock Infinite's Columbia, there's still the sense that something is just a little bit off about everything, like the people of the city have started to collectively lose their minds. If you're not dodging armed nudists frantically defending their guru, you're taking on violent golfers acting as bodyguards to a mini-golf mogul who has his own armed compound. I'm playing the soundtrack in the background of this video, and I've also started to listen to it on its own even after I finished up with the game. Probably the main appeal of the game for me was exploration and navigating the city. The environments have an impressive amount of verticality to them, and part of the fun is examining a hard to reach spot from various angles to try and figure out how to get up there. You can get lifted up by stray air currents or hitch a ride on the sky traffic across the city, which also adds a certain level of unpredictability to exploring, although getting these to work reliably took a lot of trial and error. Exploration is rewarded with money pickups, coats and skins for your weapons, or your deployable cat, who spots hidden assassins that are targeting you. But what I think is most interesting to say about the game are its flaws, and most of these stem from its main selling point, the adjustable camera. Isometric fixed views aren't anything new to games. Many older shooters such as Postal or newer titles such as Ruiner or Brigador are all played from a similar perspective, but what's notable about those is that they're designed with a single angle in mind. When Tokyo 42 was first released, enemies could be completely concealed by the environment, and it was entirely possible that you could walk around a corner, fail to spot a guard because a building was in the way, and get shot and instantly killed before you could really realise what was going on. The version I played introduced a few measures to help counteract that. Enemies were visible through the level geometry as red silhouettes, although shooting at them reliably still requires you to have the correct camera angle, and many also have markers above their heads to help you keep track of them. The game was challenging enough with all of the visual aids, so I don't even want to think about how hellish it could be on launch. To quote the game's creators, "Our very first prototypes were 2D isometric in the style of old school games like Command & Conquer or Syndicate. The problem was that we wanted 3D gameplay, with the player being able to engage atop and over structures. So after bashing our heads against that wall for a while, we switched to 3D. Core goal initially was to retain a perfect isometric perspective, so we used an orthographic camera. To further the illusion, we locked the camera to its 8 angles, so you switched rapidly between each. The gameplay idea behind this is that you can navigate very quickly to a view that makes sense. The speed is important in intense firefights. Added to this, the terrain was carefully designed so that each location had at least 3 angles, if not more, which the player needed to find for the best tactical advantage. We still think no one has gotten as close to achieving this level of interaction from this viewpoint. I still think the 8-angle rotation scheme is part of the reason that the game is as beautiful as it is, and I reckon we roughly achieved the goal we set out to do with it. The way it was received ultimately helped me personally realise that maybe a more forgiving camera schema could have potentially made the gameplay better, but I think a change to this would result in a very different game from what it is now. It is intrinsic to the game's core, and I have to say that this is a response I can understand. I can think of plenty of games where a limiting or potentially frustrating gameplay mechanic is integral to the experience. Whether or not that's a good thing is up to you. But it doesn't change the fact that this one feature that was so unpopular with a lot of critics and reviewers was a core component in the game, and not something that could be easily modified or removed. And I could get on board with the camera for the most part. My main issues were that some of the angles didn't adequately give me a sense of speed or skewed my depth perception when I was moving, something that led to more than a few deaths when I was trying to jump from one platform to another. The biggest issue by far though was when I needed to switch angles on the fly. This was at its most egregious during particularly intense firefights or the game's parkour minigame, where you have to follow a set path through the city under an incredibly punishing time limit. Platforming and navigation was a lot more pleasant without the oppressive time constraint, but switching angles on the fly while the clock was ticking down was discombobulating at best and enraging at worst. Those parkour minigames I mentioned didn't reward thinking on your feet and getting a sense for your surroundings, but instead they required countless restarts as you learned the route and its intended camera angles, through countless errors and failed attempts. I didn't feel like I was any better at platforming in the game after they were done, just that I'd learned what order to jump through the hoops the developers had laid out for me. I also want to mention the motorcycle. While it's a neat idea, it's really hard to overstate just how horrible the motorcycle felt to drive. I felt like I was barely in control of it, and I would regularly crash into walls despite my best efforts. Thankfully, I was able to cheese the game's motorcycle race mission by just reversing over the finish line a few times, as the race itself didn't have checkpoints to trap your lap progress. The game's story, while it isn't bad, is a little on the short side, although I could forgive this considering the size of the team and the fact that 2 people managed to create as much as they did, which really is a real accomplishment. Characters are talking heads that just dump exposition every so often or tell you about your next target. However, despite this, I liked their visual design, and the dialogue managed to fit a good amount of characterization into a few dozen lines of dialogue per person. The lack of voice acting meant that the dialogue text was incredibly easy to miss during a firefight, and while I liked how much personality they put forward in their short time on the screen, I thought it was a little odd how a lot of characters would mostly use British slang and idioms despite being in, Japan. But I eventually just chalked this up to the game's quirky atmosphere. If I had to just comment on a few other things story-wise, the story does seem a little bit rushed towards the end of the game. At one point, you're presented with a flashback mission, and the way it's introduced to you is a big message appears on the screen telling you this is a flashback, you're playing as another character. And as soon as it's done, the game helpfully tells you that the flashback is over. It just seems clumsy and seemed to suggest that the devs were running out of time when they were putting that particular mission together. One word of warning, the end of the main story undergoes a pretty major difficulty spike, forcing you to a series of combat scenarios, the last of which is 5 waves of enemies of escalating difficulty, and you get sent right back to the very beginning of the mission if you die, which you do if you're hit once. I had to pull out every cheesy tactic I could think of in these missions, and they quickly left a sour taste in my mouth as the prohibitive difficulty had them feel really more tedious than rewarding. In terms of final thoughts on the game, I think that while it's not perfect, it is still worth checking out if you think it looks interesting. It's an incredible achievement for such a small team, and even if you don't pay attention to that, I think that there's still some really great gameplay moments there, and I actually had a lot of fun exploring the city and sneaking around, especially the exploration. Actually, that was the part that I think I enjoyed the most. If they'd just remade this game as like a parkour simulator or like a exploration thing, I think that would have been ideal for me. They did release a DLC for those that cleared the game called Smikeshi's Castle, not to be confused obviously with Takeshi's Castle, the 80s Japanese game show that got re-released around the world. I haven't played the DLC, but I might very well pick it up in the future.